A chair pulled out and never pushed back. That was all. Just one quiet displacement, a single gesture caught mid-motion and left there. It hadn't been dragged violently nor overturned in haste. It was not the result of carelessness or drama. It had been pulled with intention once, then left slightly off mark from the table it belonged to. Perhaps there had been a sigh, a pause, a lean forward, a moment of weight in the seat. Or perhaps there hadn't even been time for that. Perhaps someone meant to sit and never did. Perhaps they rose too soon, intending to return, and then simply didn't. The chair itself didn't mind. It had no urgency. It had once known the rhythm of daily use, the scrape across floorboards, the shifting of weight, the soft wear of touch where hands once found their way to the backrest. But now it stood in that quiet, in that in-between place just a few inches away from the table's edge. A distance small enough to ignore and yet meaningful enough to notice, as if it held its breath, still waiting for someone to finish the act they'd begun. Time gathered around it gently. Dust nestled along the joints where legs met floor, subtle as snowfall. The shadow it cast didn't stretch far, just enough to define absence, not of the chair itself, but of what had once been routine. The chair did not ache to be moved back in. It had grown comfortable in that half position, not quite in place, not quite apart. It existed now not as furniture, but as memory. The table, long unbothered, bore the absence well. Its edges still waited, untouched by elbows or papers or mugs left behind. Yet the side where the chair had once tucked in seemed a little more open than the others, as though it had been left to breathe. The line of symmetry had been broken just slightly, gently, and that imbalance, instead of unsettling the space, gave it meaning. Everything didn't have to line up. Some stories are told in what doesn't return. There were no crumbs left on the seat, no impression on the cushion, no coat draped over the back, just the chair where it had last been touched. Its wood, perhaps pine or oak, had softened in tone over time, losing its shine but gaining something else in return, a kind of quiet permanence. The grain in the wood had darkened in some places and lightened in others, and the smoothness of the seat suggested it had once been used often, not ceremoniously, but familiarly, by someone who sat without thinking about the act of sitting, someone who trusted the chair to hold them and never questioned its place. And yet, now, it stood alone. It was not lonely. The room did not echo with loss. It simply accepted the presence of this object left slightly off-center. It made space for it. The floorboards beneath were neither warped nor creaking. They didn't complain. The air around it didn't rush in or stall. It simply flowed around the small distance between wood and table, as naturally as water curves around stone. Perhaps once, this had been a chair pulled out in routine, a breakfast pulled too quickly between chores, or a letter written in haste. Or maybe it was a chair pulled for company, for conversation that drifted late into the evening, until the hour grew tired and someone stood up without quite finishing their thought. There is a kind of intimacy in things left unfinished, a feeling that someone meant to return, even if they never did. There were other chairs, of course, pushed in neatly along the table's sides. They kept their posture, legs aligned and back straight. But this one, this single, gently misplaced chair, had the most to say. Not loudly, not with protest, just by staying as it was. Still a chair, still solid, but no longer where it was meant to be. Or perhaps now it was exactly where it belonged, not as furniture in use, but as the echo of movement. Sunlight came in at an angle across the floorboards, catching the slanted gap between seat and table. That light didn't need permission. It fell across the room as if brushing against memory, touching the chair like a gentle hand saying, "You are still here." Dust motes danced just above it, not enough to cloud, just enough to suggest the passage of time in the air. The room itself had no clocks. Time passed, but it was not marked. Only in such details, such quiet displacements was it felt. The chair's legs had small scuff marks near the base, faint circular patterns on the wood where it had been moved again and again. Someone once turned it sideways often, perhaps to lean an elbow over the back, perhaps to speak to someone seated nearby. That kind of casual grace now lived only in the shape of wear. The chair remembered the weight it once held, not as a burden, but as a form. It was shaped as much by stillness now as it once was by movement. And then there was the space it created, the narrow slice of emptiness between itself and the table. That space was not hollow. It held the suggestion of presence. A presence recently past or long gone. It didn't matter. The room didn't keep track. The space wasn't asking to be filled. It was simply bearing witness to what had once been. In its quiet openness, it became a kind of invitation, not to act, not to change, but to notice. Across the room, a shelf sagged faintly beneath books no longer read. A window stayed partly fogged at its edges, where seal and time had softened together. The rug beneath the table was threadbare in one spot, just beneath the chair's feet. That soft thinning of the fibers was a map of repetition. 100 sits, 100 rises, none of them recorded, and yet all remembered. The chair had played its part faithfully, and now, even in stillness, it continued to offer its history. Sometimes the wind pressed faintly against the window pane, and a low draft whispered under the sill. When it did, the edge of the chair's seat caught the breeze just enough to creak. Not loudly, just a tiny shift, a wood-on-wood murmur. The sound of something that once belonged to motion responding faintly to the idea of it. A sigh, perhaps, or maybe a memory released. Nobody came to push the chair back in. No hand reached down to tuck it neatly under the table. It didn't need correcting. This was not a space of tidiness for tidiness's sake. It was a space where moments were allowed to linger, where objects were allowed to remain just as they were left. The room had long since given up any illusion of waiting. It had learned the deeper patience of simple being. It was not a museum, not a shrine, not a forgotten place. It was simply a room where something once happened, and where the evidence of that happening had not been cleared away. The chair stayed out because it had been pulled out, and time moved forward without insisting on tidiness. There is a strange kind of peace in that, in the notion that not every act must be concluded, that not every object needs to be set straight, that sometimes a chair pulled out and never pushed back can be enough to speak volumes. It doesn't need someone to interpret its story. It tells the truth just by standing there, slightly askew. If someone were to enter now, if a person, long absent, were to walk through the door and notice the chair, what would they do? Would they push it back in with a soft laugh, wondering who had left it out? Or would they sit down again, as if continuing a conversation paused mid-sentence years ago? Or would they simply stand still, hand on the backrest, recognizing something too quiet to name? The chair wouldn't react. It would receive. It would accept. That's all it had ever done. And whether or not anyone returned to it, it had already fulfilled its purpose. Not just in holding someone's weight, but in holding their absence. In marking that a moment had occurred and then receded, and yet still mattered enough to remain in form. The dust would continue to gather at the feet. The shadow would stretch and shrink with the day. The silence around it would shift slightly with the breathing of the house. And through all of this, the chair would remain as it was, just a little away from where it once belonged, still shaped by someone's gesture, still open to the memory of them. And that, quietly, gently, without insistence, would be enough. The candle had burned to nothing, not with drama, not with a flare or a sputtering gasp. It had simply dwindled, softened, and yielded. Its light, once steady and small, had drawn itself inward and downward until there was nothing left to hold. The wick, exhausted, curled into ash. The wax, once solid, once patient, once slowly surrendering itself to heat, had vanished, absorbed by time and intention. And now all that remained was a faint scent of warmth and an empty dish, barely sticky with what once was. No one saw the moment the light gave out. That's the way of these things. Candles don't make announcements when they finish. They don't call attention to their last breath of flame. They simply go, and the room doesn't notice at first. The walls don't complain. The table doesn't grieve. But slowly, inevitably, darkness begins to gather in the corners, and the absence becomes more real than the light ever was. The candle had burned to nothing, and yet it had done its work. It had given light without questioning how long it had left to do so. It had burned in stillness without complaint, as the room went about its quiet ways. It had seen things, if a candle can be said to see. Pages turned, tea cooled, hands stilled in thought. It had been there for silence, for breath, for hours passed without measure. And now it was gone. But even in its absence, it left something behind. Not wax, not soot, but memory. The memory of a glow, a softness in the air, the slight golden tint that once pressed against the walls. That glow lingers, even when the eye can no longer see it. It lives in the space between shadows. It hums faintly in the cool that replaces warmth. You can still tell where the candle stood. The tabletop remembers. There's a slight ring where heat once kissed the surface, a suggestion of shape, of weight. It's not a mark you would notice unless you were looking, but if you place your hand over it, it feels different, warmer somehow. Or maybe that's just your mind, conjuring up a memory your body hasn't let go of yet. The room feels quieter now. Not empty, not abandoned. Just paused, as if waiting for the next light, the next source of presence. The candle never filled the room with brightness. It wasn't meant to. Its job was not to banish darkness, only to temper it, to make it gentle, to soften the edges of things so that they could be seen, not solved. Its final moments weren't desperate. There was no flare, no final burst of glory, only a gradual lessening, a retreat, a yielding to the inevitable, and in that yielding, something peaceful was expressed. The way one might fall asleep while still holding a thought. Silence comes not when conversation ends, but when it has said enough. The candle had burned to nothing, and yet its light still lived in the room's memory, in the way shadows moved more slowly now, in the hush that followed, in the recognition that something had ended, even if no one had witnessed the end. There's a particular loneliness in the image of a burned-out candle, not because it is tragic, but because it is final. It is the kind of ending that doesn't announce itself, but makes itself known in the shift of atmosphere. You come into the room and feel that something is missing, not sharply, but softly, like a breath that isn't there to warm the air. The dish that once held the candle still rests where it was. You could remove it, but something in you resists. It doesn't feel right to disturb it just yet. The space where it stood feels sacred now, not in a ceremonial way, but in a quiet acknowledgement of use, of purpose fulfilled, of presence that was given freely and is now complete. Perhaps this wasn't the first candle to burn down in that dish. Perhaps others came before it, different colors, different scents, different seasons. Each one had its own life, its own moment of offering. Each one burned, not to be remembered, but simply because that's what it was made to do. And this one too was made for this, to vanish slowly, to exchange itself for light. And when it had no more to give, it stopped. We don't often pause to thank these small things. Candles, like many forms of light, are meant to be background. They do not demand. They do not interrupt. They only serve. And yet, when one is gone, we notice. The space feels colder, not by degrees, but in texture. The light that once layered itself over things is now missing, and the objects around you settle into a new kind of stillness. The candle had burned to nothing, but not before it gave itself fully. And in that, there is something deeply human. To offer warmth, to soften darkness, to hold space for reflection, and then to go, not with fanfare, but with humility. The last flicker of flame might still live somewhere in your thoughts. You might remember the way it trembled when someone walked past, or the way it leaned gently toward the draft from the window. You might recall the little puddle of wax that curled into abstract shapes, now hardened, now cool. Those patterns are gone now, absorbed into the memory of the room. There is no sadness in this, only stillness. The kind that comes after music has stopped, when your ears still feel the shape of the notes. The kind that comes when you wake in the middle of the night and know, somehow, that something small has changed. You could light another candle, and eventually, you will. Not to replace the one that's gone, but to begin again. That's how light works. It doesn't stay. It passes on. It lends itself to the next moment, the next need, and the next silence. But for now, the room holds the quiet well. It wears the absence like a blanket, not cold, just honest. There is nothing missing that wasn't meant to leave. The candle did what it was meant to do. It offered light. It burned. It ended. And in that, it gave something more permanent than itself. A memory of light. A quietness touched by warmth. An echo of something gentle. Sometimes the most enduring things are those that leave no trace, but still shape the space they leave behind. The candle had burned to nothing, yes, but its light was not gone. It had simply found a place to rest. Footprints in dust, leading nowhere. They began in the far corner of the room, faint and quiet, not loud, not deep, not stamped in with urgency, just impressions in a soft layer of dust that had settled long ago and never been disturbed enough to rise again. There were no smudges, no trails of sweeping motion, only footprints. Still, silent and unexpected. They were not new, but not old enough to disappear either. They had lasted, not because they were meant to, but because nothing had come after them. They told no story at first glance, just marks. Left foot, right foot, a gentle heel to toe, repeating across a space that hadn't seen footsteps in some time. They led across the floor without pattern, not toward the door, not toward the window, not toward anything specific. They bent slightly around the arm of a chair and then curved once more. Then they simply stopped. There was no final turn, no heavy weight that signaled arrival. Just an end, half a footstep mid-shift, as though the person had paused and then quietly faded from the room, leaving only the dust to tell the story. No one noticed them for years. The room had become one of those quiet spaces that drifted out of daily use. A room for later, for storage, for someday. The kind of room that still had a purpose, just not one clearly named. Its windows were shuttered most days, and the air hung in a soft stillness, like breath held at the edge of a sigh. Shadows gathered more than light, and in that hush, the footprints remained. They were small, but not childlike, the size of someone with careful steps, not hurried, not heavy. Whoever had walked there had done so with softness, perhaps deliberately, perhaps unconsciously. The soles were smooth, not marked by tread or thick rubber, slippers maybe, or stocking feet. Quiet shoes that made no sound even when sound was allowed. They weren't running away. They weren't arriving. They were simply moving until they weren't. The dust itself was not thick, just enough to hold shape. It had settled gently over time, 1,000 layers of still air folding themselves into fine gray, undisturbed by wind or broom or passing feet. The room had not been cleaned, not because it was abandoned, but because it had been forgotten in the kindest way, like a memory placed on a shelf, not needed now, but not discarded. Just resting. A chair sat near the footprints, its fabric faded, its legs slightly uneven. One might think someone had been walking toward it, or from it. But the steps never got close enough to suggest either. They simply passed near, like someone drifting past an old memory, not sure whether to sit or move on. There was a low table beside the chair with a cupping ring etched into the wood, the kind left behind by something warm, once placed down gently, left to cool without ceremony. There were other signs of a life paused in motion. A book, half open, pages curling with time. A clock on the mantel whose hands had stopped not at midnight or noon, but at some uncertain moment in between, neither significant nor random. Just a moment, frozen. And across the floor, the footprints curved softly past it all, as though moving within the space without interrupting it, as though trying not to disturb the room even as they passed through. It was tempting to assign meaning, to wonder, who walked here? What were they thinking? Where were they going? But sometimes footprints are only that, evidence of passage, not declarations, not stories demanding to be told. Just quiet reminders that someone once moved through a place and left something behind, even if only the smallest of traces. There was no way to follow them. They didn't lead to a door or a trap door or a curtain pulled aside. They didn't end with an answer, just a final mark, mid-shift, and then nothing. The dust resumed its blankness. The room stretched on beyond it, empty and calm. No further signs, no scuff, no trail. It was as if the person had stepped out of the moment itself, not vanished, not disappeared, but gently stopped existing within the room. Not with fear or force, but with a quiet decision. The way a candle might burn low without flickering, simply lowering into stillness until only the scent remains. And the scent did remain. Not strong, not even nameable, just the faintest hint of something familiar. Perhaps lavender, perhaps cedar, the kind of smell woven into wood and cloth and memory. The kind that says someone was here, not recently, but not long enough ago to be completely gone. The air in the room felt different near the footprints. Not colder, not warmer, just aware. As if the space itself still remembered the person who had walked through it. As if the floor remembered the pressure and the walls remembered the passing motion. As if silence was not empty, but filled with presence. There were no other markings, no fallen objects, no clues. The person had taken nothing with them and left nothing but gently moved dust. No notes, no open doors, no trailing fabric. Just steps, ending nowhere, and held in time. Sometimes, the most powerful evidence of a life is what isn't explained, what resists closure. These footprints didn't offer revelation. They offered pause, a moment to stop and notice that even stillness has a memory. That dust, undisturbed, can cradle the shape of something once moving. And that movement doesn't always need a destination to matter. People often think meaning comes from where we're going, but the room and the footprints within it seemed to suggest otherwise. That perhaps it is enough that we were here for a time. That the pattern of our days, the ordinary motion of walking across a quiet floor, can leave marks that outlast the moments themselves. Marks that don't demand attention, only recognition. And even that, perhaps, is optional. Because the footprints weren't calling out. They didn't shine or catch the light. They weren't framed or marked or roped off. They simply were. Waiting. Or not even waiting. Just being. Present in the softest possible way. And still, they led nowhere. And perhaps that was the point. Not all things need to lead. Not all paths are pathways. Some are just movements across a space. Glimpses of intention, echoes of being. The footprints were evidence not of direction, but of existence. a quiet record that someone once stepped lightly through a place, and did so without rushing, without noise, without seeking anything more than the moment they were in. If you stood in the room long enough, you could almost feel the rhythm of those steps. Not imagine them, feel them. The gentle pace, the near-silent shuffle, the hesitation, the veer, the pause. It was like listening to a song where the notes had faded, but the melody still hummed inside your bones. Not remembered, but known. The footprints in dust were not a story with a plot. They were a poem written in presence, a fragment of breath preserved in powder. A way of saying, "Here I am," without asking anyone to reply. Eventually, the dust will shift. A breeze, a shoe, a broom, or even a curious hand will pass through, and the footprints will blur, dissolve, and rejoin the blankness. But something will remain. Not the shape, not the pattern. Just the idea that something passed through. That movement once happened here. That stillness, too, can be marked by memory. And when they're gone, they won't really be gone. Because once seen, once truly noticed, the footprints leave a second imprint, one that lives in the quiet knowledge that the ordinary matters. That leading nowhere is still movement. That sometimes the trace is the destination. So the footprints in dust stayed, leading nowhere and offering nothing but their soft, fading existence. And that was enough. The door remained unlatched, not open, not closed, just resting gently against its frame, as though waiting for someone to notice. There was no breeze to push it inward or pull it out, and yet it moved sometimes, just enough to make a sound. A soft creak, barely more than a whisper, the kind of sound that might make you look over your shoulder, not out of fear, but curiosity. It was not a door that protested being touched. It did not groan with rust or resist its hinges. It simply remained, unlatched, waiting, but not in a hurry. The house itself had long since quieted, not abandoned, but slow, a place where footsteps were rare and voices even more so. Still, the air remembered sound. The walls held it like folded paper, the way old letters keep the scent of ink even after the words have faded. Somewhere upstairs, a curtain stirred, though no hand had moved it. A clock ticked 2 rooms away, and near the threshold, the door, never locked, never shut tight, rested in the same gentle position it had known for days or months, or maybe longer than that. Someone had once latched it. That much could be felt. Not seen, necessarily. There were no fresh scratches on the wood, no marks around the lock. But the kind of care that placed a latch once is the kind of care that doesn't disappear entirely. The door had been made to shut properly. Its frame was built for it, fitted snugly. Yet something, some small shift, had led to it staying ajar. Maybe it had been left that way by someone meaning to return soon. Maybe the latch had grown stiff and was easier to ignore. Or maybe, just maybe, it had been a choice to let the boundary blur. It wasn't open enough to invite the wind, nor closed enough to keep it out. In that small in-between space, neither open nor sealed, was something soft, a gesture, not a statement. The door let in sound. Not all of it. Just the faintest things. The chirp of a bird arranging itself on a windowsill, the rustle of a branch brushing the outer wall. Sometimes, if the light struck just right, a thin gold bar would stretch from the porch floor across the threshold and kiss the floorboards inside. It wouldn't stay long, just long enough to be noticed. Then it would fade again, as if shy about being seen. The doorframe held a smudge where fingers had often touched it, not out of thought, but habit. You could imagine someone resting a hand there as they passed, day after day, week after week, maybe on their way out to gather something, or on their way in, half thinking of a conversation, a meal, a memory. The latch itself was made of old brass, dulled now, but still holding the shape of intention. It was a simple hook and eye, nothing heavy, nothing ornate. A latch designed not to fortify, but to gesture toward privacy. The sort of thing one uses when solitude is preferred but not enforced. And yet now, it remained untouched. The hook dangling loosely, never quite meeting the eye, as if someone had meant to fasten it but had been called away, or had changed their mind at the last second. That moment, the not-quite decision, had stretched itself across the days. The unlatched door became part of the house's breath, its pause. It was not disrepair. It was memory made physical. Inside the room, the air was cool and still. The floorboards bore the gentle dips of long use, paths worn by countless small journeys. From the door to the table, from the table to the chair, from the chair to the hearth. The light filtering through the doorway made those paths more visible. Dust swirled in the beam, not as a sign of neglect, but as a record of quiet. The particles danced in place, not moving forward, not moving back. Like everything else, they waited. Near the door, a rug sat slightly rumpled. One corner curled as though someone's boot had caught it once. Long ago. No one had smoothed it. Not because no one cared, but because the moment hadn't required it. Some things are left not because they're overlooked, but because they feel right that way. Part of a memory no one wants to straighten out. Sometimes a leaf would slip in through the unlatched door, not with force, not blown in violently, but sliding as if it had been invited. It would rest near the threshold for a while, its edges trembling ever so slightly in the indoor air, before settling. There were a few of them now, brown, thin, curled like sleeping hands. They gathered not in a mess, but in offering, like tokens from a world just outside, reminders that outside had not forgotten the inside. Beyond the door, the porch held a single chair, worn wood. The paint long since weathered away. It faced slightly off-center, not toward the road, but toward the side yard, where wild grass grew in tufts between stones. A watering can lay on its side near the step, and a tin cup rested on the railing, its rim catching drops of rain now and then, though it had not been touched in a long while. Still, nothing had fallen over. Nothing had been swept clean either. It all felt paused. The kind of pause that doesn't mind its length. There was no sign of a struggle, no disruption, only the gentle suggestion of someone having once lived here, and maybe still living here in the smallest ways. Not in footsteps or voices, but in the open-endedness of things. The dishes had been put away, but the tea towel remained draped over the handle of the oven. The chair by the fire was empty, but angled as though it had just been stood from. A newspaper lay folded on the corner of the table. Not current, but not yellowed. The stories inside had once mattered to someone. The air in the house held the scent of time itself. Not dust, not mold, but wood warmed slowly by sun and memory. There was a comfort in it. Not the kind of comfort that soothes pain, but the kind that makes space for stillness. The kind that says, yes, this is how it is, and that's all right. The unlatched door was part of that message. An invitation not to rush, a reminder that some things are left ajar because not everything needs finishing. At night, the door made its softest sounds. The house, cooler now, would settle into itself. The latch might sway slightly if the night wind brushed the house gently enough. It never clicked into place, never slammed. The door stayed where it was, faithful to its place, but never demanding more of itself than to remain. If someone had come by in the dark, they might not even have noticed the door wasn't shut tight. They might have assumed it was just the wind or the shape of an old house breathing. And if that visitor had stepped close, just close enough to put a hand on the wood, they might have felt the warmth of touch still lingering, the faint trace of presence that does not shout, but hums gently just below notice. They might have stepped inside or not. That part never mattered. What mattered was that the door had allowed for it, that it had made no barrier of itself, that it remained a quiet threshold between within and without. Some doors are meant to close firmly, to separate, to protect, to end things, but not this one. This door belonged to the kind of home that believed in second thoughts. They believed someone might come back, or pass through, or change their mind. The latch was never broken, just unused. There was no lock because there had never been a need for one. And maybe in some quiet part of the story, that was the most important detail. Not everything unlatched is unsafe. Not everything open is unguarded. Sometimes it is the decision not to close a door that keeps something tender alive. The possibility of return, the promise of pause, the comfort of knowing that nothing has to be final just yet. And so the door remained as it was, unlatched, and the house, in its quiet, in-between way, was whole. Some goodbyes aren't meant to last. Departures that carry no finality, only pause. Some people leave to return, even if they don't say it aloud. Even if their steps fade into the distance and the house grows quiet in their absence, the silence that follows does not feel like abandonment. It feels like a held breath, like a page left mid-sentence. Whoever left never intended it to be forever speaks to this kind of absence. Not a vanishing, but a pause that stretched longer than expected. Not an end, but a soft, unclosed door. There is something distinct in the kind of quiet that follows a temporary departure that becomes indefinite. It holds no bitterness, only waiting. The room still remembers the shape of their presence. Not because of anything dramatic or obvious, but because of how many small things remain. A coat is still hanging by the door. A pair of shoes tucked neatly, not abandoned, but paused mid-use. A favorite mug left just so, clean but not put away. These aren't the remains of someone who disappeared. They are the marks of someone who stepped out, believing they would soon step back in. The room doesn't feel hollow. It feels expectant, as though even now, after all this time, it's still listening for the sound of footsteps on the threshold. People leave for all sorts of reasons, an errand, a task, a change of heart. Sometimes they don't say why, perhaps because they don't fully know. But not all departures carry the same weight. There's a difference between walking away and walking out for a while. You can feel it in what's left behind. In the way, the chair isn't pushed in. In the way, the calendar still hangs on the wall with a week circled that has long since passed. It's not neglect. It's the residue of intention. They meant to come back. And so, nothing was closed. Nothing was sealed shut. The drawers weren't emptied. The plants were watered for a few extra days. Maybe a note was left. Not a farewell, but a reminder. Back soon, it might have said, or simply nothing at all because the absence wasn't meant to be felt. The house wasn't braced for loss. It wasn't rearranged into absence. It was paused like a sentence waiting for the next word. But time doesn't wait with the same patience. Slowly, quietly, the days passed. The rooms grew still. What's strange is how that stillness doesn't feel final. Even years later, there's a softness to it, a kind of quiet that continues to expect, even when logic no longer does. Because the kind of leaving that wasn't tea meant to be forever carries a different scent in the air. It doesn't turn cold. It stays warm, as though the person who left is still only a few steps away. As if at any moment, the doorknob will turn. The hallway will echo with a returning step. It's not hope exactly. It's not that active. It's more like openness, the space inside things that has not been closed off. And so, nothing is touched. The book is still on the nightstand. The clock is still ticking, even if no one listens. The room doesn't demand that the leaving be resolved. It just holds space, quietly, tenderly. Because it knows the difference between someone who left and someone who meant to return. It remembers how the door was shut, not slammed, not locked. Just gently clicked into place, like a promise made without words. Maybe they didn't even know it would be this long. Maybe they turned the corner and something pulled them further away than they'd planned. Life does that sometimes. A small detour becomes a winding road. A short trip stretches into silence, and the return, once so simple, begins to feel like a story that needs more courage to tell. But that doesn't undo the original intention. The leaving was never forever. That part still stands. You can tell by what they didn't do. They didn't empty the space. They didn't erase themselves from it. There are no sharp edges to their absence, only softness. They left with the gentleness of someone who expected to return with the same ease. And perhaps that's why it still feels so fresh. Not painful, just close. As though the moment they left and the moment you sit in now are only a breath apart. The seasons changed, of course. The curtains faded in the sun. Dust gathered in corners no one reaches. But none of that means the story ended. The story, like the room, is paused. There's something sacred in that kind of pause. A space that remains open, not because it clings, but because it respects what once filled it. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't rush to fill the silence. It simply holds it. And sometimes, in the stillness, you can almost feel it. The presence that once was, and maybe still is, just not here. The voice that might still hum in another room. The laugh that lingers faintly in the wallpaper, in the way the light falls through the same window. These aren't ghosts. They're memories so near to the surface that they've never quite sunk. The person may be gone, but their intention echoes. I didn't mean to be away so long. There's a certain grace in not being forgotten. Even more so in not being erased. When you leave a space as though you'll return, you trust it to hold your shape. You believe in continuity, in the gentleness of the waiting. And sometimes it does. The room, the house, the place. It waits not out of sadness, but out of faith. And that faith becomes a kind of love. Quiet, patient, undemanding. This kind of absence doesn't ask for closure. It doesn't require answers. It simply exists as an open bracket. One side closed, the other waiting. That waiting may stretch across days or years or a lifetime, but it doesn't break. Because it was built not on urgency, but on softness. A promise implied, not spoken. A return delayed, not denied. We often think of leaving as a breaking, but it isn't always. Sometimes it's just a pause that lengthens. A chapter that hasn't been written yet. An echo still finding its way back. And the things we leave behind, our objects, our spaces, our unfinished gestures, they tell the story of our intention. They say, I was here. I meant to be again. Perhaps that's why the quiet of such places doesn't feel heavy. It's not grief that fills the air. It's recognition. The place remembers. It doesn't need to be reminded. It doesn't resent the absence. It carries it like a small folded note, tucked into its pocket, still warm from the hand that wrote it. And in its way, it keeps the door open, even if no one knocks. Whoever left never intended it to be forever. You can see that in the way nothing quite feels finished. The coat is still hanging, the dishes are still stacked, the note is still there, not as relics, not as evidence, but as quiet companions of a moment that once lived. They aren't clinging. They are keeping space. Not for anyone in particular, but for the idea of return itself. And that is a kind of comfort. Because return doesn't have to mean physically coming back. Sometimes it's a thought that drifts in unexpectedly. A scent that fills your chest with the memory of someone. A sound that brings them back into the room for just a moment. And in those moments, it becomes clear. Not everything that left is truly gone. Not every departure is a loss. Some are simply extensions of presence, stretched across time, connected by memory and care. The absence that was never meant to be forever is tender. It doesn't fade sharply. It softens. It finds its way into your routine until one day you realize that the waiting has become part of the space itself, not as emptiness, but as invitation. A door not closed, a light left on, a space that doesn't beg to be filled but is still ready, just in case. And even if the return never comes in the way it was imagined, the space remains honored. The pause remains meaningful. Because the leaving was not cruel. It was not careless. It was simply incomplete. And that incompletion is its own kind of beauty. An unfinished song, a letter that trails off mid-sentence, a goodbye that ends with a comma, not a period. There is comfort in knowing that what was once shared still lingers. That intention has its own kind of permanence, that the hand that turned the doorknob did so lightly, trusting the space to hold itself in the meantime. And it has. It always has. The space has held. The memories have stayed. The silence has grown soft around the edges. And perhaps somewhere, the one who left remembers too. Perhaps they think of it, of you, of the place they meant to return to, and maybe they don't know how to come back. Maybe too much time has passed. But the promise remains, however faint. It was never meant to be forever. And so, the door remains just a little ajar. Not wide, not beckoning. Just open enough to allow possibility. The light filters in. The air stirs gently, and nothing rushes. Everything waits, not with desperation, but with grace. Because whoever left, wherever they are, left behind something more than silence. They left behind the memory of presence, the imprint of return, the warmth of having once been here, and the possibility of being here again. The world moved without record. And yet, it moved. Somewhere, a tree dropped a leaf. No one heard it fall. No one saw the small rotation it made mid-air, or the way it caught a breath of wind and gently coasted sideways before settling into the soil. The leaf did not make a statement. It did not demand commemoration. It simply let go, and the world made no note of it. Yet the letting go mattered, even if only to the branch that now felt lighter. Elsewhere, water in a shallow stream rearranged a pebble. The shift was no more than a centimeter, a minute bump as current built against one edge and gently nudged the stone from its resting place. There was no mark, no date, no sign, but it happened. The tiny rock found a new angle to rest on, and the stream continued murmuring as it always had. No one chronicled this moment, and yet the stream would remember it in the shape of its flow long after observers had turned away. In a far corner of a forgotten town, a window creaked open just slightly, perhaps from the wind or a fault in its old wooden frame. The room inside remained undisturbed, bathed in soft, lazy shadows. The light shifted by degrees, inching across the dust-coated floor, climbing the wall as the sun traced its arc. No pen recorded it. No voice announced the slow sweep of time against silence. But the light moved all the same, patient and precise. The world has always known how to continue without needing an audience. It does not slow down for the absent eye or halt in the absence of a witness. A bird lands, then flies again. A blossom opens, then closes. Grass grows up through the forgotten cracks of a long-abandoned path. None of these demand applause. Their entire cycle might pass unremarked by human attention, and yet the cycle completes, whole and dignified. There was a time when people believed history only happened if it was written down, as if ink gave life to time, as if memory required margin notes to be valid. But most of life occurs outside the scope of records. The vast ocean of small, unrecorded events forms the true rhythm of existence. It is not in declarations or milestones, but in the way curtains stir when no one watches, in the way a cat naps and stretches and naps again, entirely uninterested in legacy. When we say the world moved without record, it is not an accusation. It is not regret. It is simply a description of truth. Because records are artifacts of attention, and attention is selective, and the world does not wait to be selected. The grain of time continues pouring whether someone is counting or not. Imagine a kitchen that has not been entered in years. The kettle is still there, sitting on the stove as if it might be used any moment. The cupboard doors are slightly ajar, and the sugar bowl holds a spoon tilted slightly, as if caught mid-gesture. The calendar on the wall has not been turned. Its pages are yellowed and still. Dust lines the windowsill. And yet, outside that kitchen, the seasons have come and gone. The sun has warmed the brick walls. Rain has trickled down the eaves. Insects have woven delicate corners into nets of patient thread. The house exists, not in pause, but in quiet continuation. Nothing stopped. It simply shifted into a quieter rhythm. Somewhere else, an old field once marked by fences now lies open. The posts have fallen, the wires are rusted and buried, but grasses sway where feet once trod. Wind writes its own invisible patterns across the tall blades. No ledger notes when the field changed from pasture to wilderness. But the field knows, the soil knows, the roots know. There is a memory held in texture, not in text. Sometimes the world's motion without record is what allows us to breathe. If everything were noted, if every heartbeat had to be justified, if every blink demanded annotation, there would be no space for stillness. But the world moves in gentle, unmeasured ways, in soft repetitions, in lulls and loops, in small, nearly invisible changes. The world allows itself to be forgotten so that we too may forget for a moment and rest. Consider how many thoughts you've had that were never spoken aloud. How many sensations passed through your skin, goosebumps, a tickle of breeze, the weight of sleep in your limbs, without ever needing to be named. These are records of a different kind, internal, private, felt. The kind that fade gently rather than ending sharply. They are part of the world's motion too, even if no one else knows. In one room, an old radio still hums, though no station speaks through it. A frequency that once meant something now fills the air with low, ambient static. Someone left it on, maybe years ago, and now it speaks only to itself. But the sound remains. The electricity flows. The device continues its quiet task. Unacknowledged, but not meaningless. In a field of poppies, a seed buried last spring finally finds the right angle, the right moisture, and the right moment, and it cracks open. No journal entry announces it. No photograph captures the tremble of green beginning to push upward. But beneath the soil, life insists on itself, not loudly, but certainly, and somewhere, a library perhaps, books sit unopened for years, their spines unbroken, their pages never turned, but within them, words still rest in order. The sentences remain poised, ready to mean something again if ever needed. Their existence, even unread, holds a kind of quiet readiness. They do not vanish because no one reads them. They simply wait, as the world does, as time does, as meaning sometimes does. There is a kindness in this kind of unnoticed movement. It frees us from the burden of performance. It allows the chair to remain unpushed, the drawer slightly open, and the lamp to remain off. Nothing demands fixing. Nothing cries out for correction. There is peace in things continuing quietly. Peace in a rhythm that does not shout, but murmurs. The world moves without record. It always has. Before the first story was ever carved into stone, rain had fallen and stars had risen. Before the first name was written, people had loved and lost, grown old, and closed their eyes at the end of a day. All unmarked, all real, all complete in their quiet unfolding. Even now, as you read or listen, your own breath is part of this motion. Inhale, exhale. No one will write it down. And yet it is everything. The way your chest lifts, the way it falls again, the small pause in between. These are the movements that shape a life. Not the headlines, not the declarations, but this. The soft repetition of existence, without a record. In the silence of rooms long abandoned, in the stillness of fields no longer walked, and in the gentle creaks of floorboards settling into themselves, the world continues. The clock does not need winding to keep time. The wind does not need permission to carry the scent of lilac through an empty alleyway. The moon does not need observers to shine. It is tempting to believe that without a record, things are lost. But perhaps it is in this absence of documentation that things are truly free. Free to unfold without interpretation. Free to fade without struggle. Free to mean only what they meant in the moment and nothing more. The world moved without record, and it still does. Every blink, every unnoticed shadow, every leaf that falls between seasons, every silence between words, all of it continues. A calendar that stopped turning is not just a forgotten object. It is a quiet moment, suspended. It is a conversation that ended mid-sentence, a pause that was never resumed. The paper still hangs, still folds neatly along the creases where each month once flipped forward. But now it rests, permanently, on a date that no longer applies, on days that no longer arrive, and yet no one removes it, no one corrects it. It remains, as if still waiting for a hand to come and turn the page. But the hand never comes. At first, you might not notice it. You might pass the calendar in the hallway or above a desk, catching only the corner of it in your eye. A glance, an unconscious knowing that it has always been there. It doesn't call attention to itself. It doesn't feel out of place. But one day, without ceremony, you see it. You stop, and you read the date, June, or maybe October, or March. The year is wrong. The month no longer matches the season. The numbered days are ghosts, tasks that will not be done, appointments that have long since expired. And yet there it is. A single square may be marked with a faded note, Doctor, 2 p.m. M or call M. The ink has softened, blurred slightly over time, and the name might no longer matter. The urgency that once lived in those letters is gone. The appointment was missed or kept or canceled. The memory of it has already folded into the layers of other days, but the paper holds it still, quietly. The calendar remains unchanged, not because someone meant to preserve it, but because they forgot to change it, or didn't feel the need, or couldn't bring themselves to. There is a story in that silence. It is not dramatic. It is not even necessarily sad. It is simply a moment that refused to move forward, a choice that became a habit that became stillness. A calendar is a tool meant to chase time, to measure it, arrange it, make it manageable. It assumes motion. It expects you to keep turning its pages, to keep reaching forward into what comes next. But when a calendar stops, the illusion breaks. Time still moves, yes. Days still pass. But the calendar no longer follows. It no longer keeps up. It becomes a relic, a monument to a moment when motion paused. There is something gentle in that pause. Not always joyful, not always mournful, just gentle. A softness, like dust, gathering in a place no longer tread. The stopped calendar becomes an object outside of time. It no longer tells you what day it is. It tells you what day it once was, and what day someone last noticed. There is power in that kind of stillness. It resists the pace of the world. It refuses to move for the sake of moving. A calendar that stopped turning becomes a quiet refusal to forget a specific moment, or to allow that moment to be overwritten by the countless others that followed. Perhaps the date it froze on meant something, a birthday, an anniversary, the day someone left, or the day someone arrived, or perhaps the date meant nothing at all. It was just the last day someone remembered to look, and then they didn't again. There is mystery in that, the kind that doesn't ask to be solved, only to be noticed. You may be tempted, upon seeing it, to reach out and turn the page, to update it, to bring it in line with the present. But something stops you, not guilt, not superstition, just a feeling, a respect for the quiet that has settled around it. The calendar, in its stillness, belongs more to memory now than to planning. It no longer organizes time. It holds it. And when something holds time instead of chasing it, it becomes a different kind of object altogether. It becomes a mirror. You look at the date, frozen, unmoving, and you remember what you were doing then. Not just on that day, but in that time. What the air felt like. What music did you hear? What thoughts weighed on your mind? You remember who you were becoming and who you no longer are. The calendar does not show you the future. It shows you what was once now and how far you've come from it. That square marked call M was once a promise. Maybe it was fulfilled. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe M doesn't need to be called anymore. Maybe they do. The calendar doesn't say. It only remembers what you asked it to remember. It holds the note without judgment. Sometimes there are pictures on the calendar. A lighthouse, a kitten, a still life of apples in a bowl. These images feel faded too, as if the months have drained their color. They are not vibrant anymore, but they are still present, like memories that have softened at the edges. They once stood for the newness of that month. Now they feel like part of a museum exhibit. This was July once. There may even be other marks on the calendar. Scribbled out plans, check marks, circled dates, a series of X's running through a week like a trail of breadcrumbs. These are not just marks of what was done. They are evidence of movement, of intent, of a time when each square held the future in miniature. But now the future has moved on, and the calendar has not. In a drawer somewhere, perhaps there are other calendars, stacked, bound, filled with entire years of plans and crossings out, some complete, some barely touched. We measure our lives in them more often than we realize. And when one of them stops turning, when it ceases to keep up, it does not lose its meaning. It gains a different one. It becomes a kind of quiet anchor, a place where time stopped, not because it failed, but because something else became more important. The world shifted, priorities changed, or maybe time itself just softened. There is a difference between forgetting to turn a page and choosing not to. And in the stopped calendar, you cannot always tell which it was. The ambiguity is part of its quiet poetry. Perhaps the calendar hangs in a room no longer used. A study, a hallway, a guest bedroom that no one has slept in for years. The air there is different, the silence deeper. The light comes in sideways through closed curtains. And the calendar waits, not expectantly, but patiently, not needing to be turned, not asking to be relevant again. Sometimes visitors notice. "Oh," they say, glancing at the year, "that's old." But they don't touch it. Somehow they know not to. Some things are allowed to remain exactly as they are. There's a small beauty in that kind of allowance. We so often ask objects to be useful, to perform, to assist us in our movement from one day to the next. But when something stops being useful and is still kept, it becomes a vessel, not of function, but of meaning. A calendar that no longer tells you what day it is may still tell you who you were. It holds a version of you that believed certain things would happen, that noted them down with confidence, that hoped or feared or simply planned. The frozen month becomes a mirror to that past self, how they measured their time, what they considered worth writing down. It is a portrait made of rectangles. In its stillness, the calendar asks nothing of you. It does not insist that you update it. It does not chastise you for letting it lapse. It just waits. Its job is finished now, or perhaps it never really began. Either way, it has become something else. A quiet reminder, a still square of time, and so it hangs, unmoving, a quiet refusal to join the rush, a gentle protest against the relentless turning of days. And though the months have moved on, though the seasons outside the window have cycled again and again, the calendar remains exactly where it is. It does not need to be changed. It already is the change. The kind you don't notice until one day, you do. And then, everything feels a little quieter, a little slower, a little more like memory. A calendar that stopped turning is not broken. It is simply listening. And that might be enough. There was a time when the map made sense. A time when each point, each careful mark etched into parchment or inked onto worn paper, aligned with the heavens. When the stars themselves seemed to participate in the act of being known, leaning down as if to say, "Yes, you see us, and yes, we are where you say we are." But that time had quietly passed, not with any drama or sudden revelation, just a slow, nearly imperceptible shift, until one night someone happened to look up and realize that what once was fixed had drifted. The sky chart still hung in the same place on the eastern wall. Its edges had curled with age, and a slight yellowing had seeped through its paper, like tea stains or forgotten sunlight. The ink had faded in places, but the constellations were still visible. Named, connected by the faintest of lines, guiding whoever glanced at them back into a sky that no longer looked quite the same. At first, no one noticed. The sky had always changed, seasonally, subtly. A star a little higher here, a planet wandering there. But something deeper had begun to happen. The familiar formations, the hunter with his belt, the swan with its outstretched wings, the serpent winding through eternal blackness, they were still present, but they didn't quite fit anymore. Like clothing kept too long, stretched and softened at the seams. The stars had not disappeared. They had not gone out or blinked away into some celestial abyss. They were there, shining steadily, but they were no longer following the instructions. It became clear that the chart was no longer a map, but a memory. It had been made in a time when people trusted the permanence of things, when they believed that enough observation could reveal truth, that enough ink on enough parchment could hold the sky still. But the stars had not agreed. Perhaps they never had. Some said the sky had changed because the world beneath it had. Cities grew where there had been forest. Silence turned into static. The watchers forgot to look up. Maybe the stars had simply lost interest. Or maybe the truth was simpler. It was always like this, and we are only just now learning how to notice what doesn't stay the same. The room in which the chart hung was quiet, as if in mourning or meditation. Dust moved in slow spirals through the air, catching the dim, indirect light in soft golden hues. The telescope in the corner still worked. Its brass was tarnished, its lens gently fogged by time, but it remained pointed outward, faithful, though no longer exact. The old journals still lined the shelves. Their spines were creased, their pages soft from use. Entries described precise positions, measured angles, and lovingly recorded observations. One entry, dated long ago, had a small note written in the margin. Tonight, the stars felt particularly there. That was all. No science, no correction, just the simple astonishment that they existed at all. Now that same stretch of sky looked unfamiliar. The observer, whoever still cared to be one, would tilt their head slightly and squint, trying to reconcile what they saw with what had once been seen. The lines didn't match. The angles were wrong. What had once been a dependable marker for seasons and stories had slipped. Some evenings, the discrepancy felt poetic, as if the stars were gently reminding us that they were not for us to pin down. That our naming, our drawing of boundaries and myths upon their bodies, was sweet, but not binding. They had played along, perhaps, out of patience, or maybe out of curiosity. But now they drifted freely, and we were left with only the echoes of what they used to be. Other evenings, the mismatch felt quietly unsettling, not because anything was broken, but because it was not. The stars were doing what stars do, moving through the galaxy, obeying rules older than humanity itself. It was we who had drawn the wrong conclusions, we who assumed permanence in something that never promised it. Still, the chart remained on the wall. No one took it down. There was something sacred in its error, something noble in its inaccuracy. It was a record of who we once were, how we once believed we could capture the sky and hold it still like a pressed flower or a jar of summer air. And perhaps we did, for a moment. Not the sky itself, but our relationship to it. That too is worth remembering. Someone once had stayed up night after night, tracing arcs and noting flickers, freezing against the chill of midnight winds, their breath clouding in the darkness as they etched each point into place. They believed in what they saw, they trusted their eyes, and their chart, though no longer true, was not wrong. It was simply then. Now the stars moved differently. Not in rebellion, not in anger, just naturally, as they always had, as they always will. And beneath them, we adjusted, or didn't. A few still came to this room, stepping softly on worn floorboards, leaving the lights low so that the dim shimmer of the chart might still feel like starlight. They didn't always look up through the telescope anymore. Sometimes they simply sat, breathing with the silence, letting the presence of the stars press gently against their skin, even if they couldn't locate them. Sometimes they would trace the lines with a finger, from point to point, remembering names like Orion and Lyra, though the actual stars had moved far from those positions. Still, the act of tracing was a kind of prayer. A quiet insistence that even when the world no longer aligned, one could still remember what it felt like when it did. And outside, the real stars burned on, unconcerned with charts or stories, untroubled by misalignment. In truth, the chart had always been a fiction, a beautiful, meticulous human fiction, an effort to make meaning from points of light so far away they might already be gone. The map had never been the territory, but it had helped us walk through it nonetheless. Now we walk differently. Some say it's disorienting, others say it's freeing. There's no longer a single path across the sky, no definitive north drawn by ancient light. But maybe that means we're allowed to write new stories, to trace new shapes, to imagine constellations not in rigid geometry, but in memory, emotion, and breath. Perhaps it is no longer about matching the chart to the stars, but learning how to let the stars remain stars, untethered by our expectations. In this room, the chart still watches. It doesn't ask for correction. It doesn't beg to be replaced. It simply is, a portrait of a moment when we thought we understood, a kind of time capsule, preserving not the sky, but our relationship to it. Sometimes, late at night, someone still leaves a small note beneath the chart. Not an amendment, not a complaint, just a few quiet words. I remember this one. Or, it used to point the way home. Or, they haven't gone. They've just wandered. There is comfort in that. Because even if the stars no longer match the map, and even if the chart is a relic of what was rather than what is, the longing to understand, the yearning to name, to follow, to align, remains intact. The sky does not owe us consistency, but it gives us wonder, and that, more than accuracy, might be what we came for in the first place. So the chart stays, a little faded, a little wrong, a little beautiful, and the stars, still burning, wait for us to look up, not to find what once was, but to notice what is. The clocks tick, but no one listens, not out of indifference nor neglect, but because the sound has simply folded itself into the silence. It is no longer a measure of urgency or movement. It no longer demands attention. It simply is, a backdrop to the stillness, a soft rhythm that continues not because anyone asks it to, but because that is what it was made to do. The clocks tick in the empty house, in the hallway where no feet pass, and in the sitting room where no eyes glance upward to check the hour. They tick into a space that has long stopped keeping time. One hangs above the fireplace, its brass hands circling slowly over a pale face lined with Roman numerals. though some have faded. The varnish on its frame is cracked but not broken. Dust has softened its shine, as though the house itself had placed a hand over it and whispered, "Hush." It still ticks, though, with a sound so faint it can barely be heard unless the room is holding its breath. But that's the thing. This room is always holding its breath. And in that breath, the tick becomes part of the exhale. Another clock stands in the hallway, tall and wooden, with a pendulum that sways as though remembering a rhythm it once believed in. Its chimes are spaced wide and slow, like someone trying to speak through a dream. No one waits for the hour to strike. No one glances through the doorway as the sound rolls out. And so the chimes echo only for the wallpaper, the faded rug, and the mirror that reflects nothing but light slipping down the walls. There is a third clock tucked in the corner of the study, a small one, wrist-sized, forgotten on a shelf beside old letters and dried ink. Its tick is the softest of them all, like a whisper in a room that hasn't been spoken in for years. The hands still move, though time doesn't seem to. They move not to count anything anymore, but because they do not know how to stop. As if time, once begun, cannot unlearn its forward motion, even when no one is watching. The clocks do not resent being unheard. They were never made to be celebrated. They were made to continue, even in silence, even in solitude. Their ticking is a kind of devotion, a quiet promise kept even when the audience has long since left. And so they tick faithfully, rhythmically, across dust and stillness, across sunlit afternoons and the slow descent of dusk. Outside, the sun moves gently across the sky, brushing light over the garden and through the curtains. Inside, the clocks mark that journey not in celebration, but in quiet acknowledgement. They do not call attention to morning or evening. They simply record the passing, a slow, steady marking of time, not as something to be filled, but as something that happens, even when no one is there to notice. Once someone might have noticed. Once the ticking might have been a comfort, a reassurance that the world was still turning. Once a person might have sat in the armchair, eyes glancing toward the mantel clock, waiting for a visitor or simply counting the minutes before tea. But now the armchair is empty, not dusty, just undisturbed. The cushion still holds the shape of someone who sat often and leaned slightly to the right. The clocks keep ticking for them, perhaps. Not in hope, not in grief, but in recognition. Someone once lived here. Someone once wound the gears, adjusted the hands, and held the clocks gently to their ear to check for life. That care lives on long after the hand that gave it has moved on. In the kitchen, an old timer rests on the windowsill. Its bell no longer rings. It has not been set in years. But it still ticks when turned, the sound of it quieter than rain, lighter than breath. It is a different kind of time here, a personal time, not public. Not the time of trains and meetings and appointments, but the time of bread rising, of tea steeping, of twilight settling gently into the corners of the room. The clocks do not know loneliness. They are not waiting. They are not wondering where everyone went. They are simply continuing. And in their continuing, they fill the space with presence, not noise. A presence that says, this moment exists. Not because someone is counting it, but because it is. The tick is not a command, not a call. It is a lullaby, steady and patient. Now and then, a bird chirps outside. A branch scrapes softly against the glass. The wind finds its way through a small gap in the windowsill. But none of these things disturb the ticking. They pass through it as though the clocks are too old, too gentle, and too steady to be interrupted. The clocks have seen many days, and they will continue to see many more. Not because they are needed, but because they are here. There is a clock in the upstairs bedroom as well. A wind-up alarm with a tiny crack on its face, sitting on a bedside table next to a lamp that hasn't been turned on in a long while. The bed is still made, the coverlet neatly tucked, the pillow gently flattened. There is no sign of rush, no sign of disturbance. The room seems held in a pause, a breath that neither inhales nor exhales, and the clock ticks through that breath, softly, endlessly. The alarm will never ring again, the mechanism long since failed, but the ticking remains. In the hallway, the tall clock continues to chime. Its bell resonates low, the kind of sound that moves through the bones of a house and settles into the floorboards. The sound does not wake anyone. It does not mark time for anyone rushing past. It simply folds into the stillness and becomes part of it. The sound lingers for a while, then fades into the hush that always follows. What does it mean to tick when no one listens? Perhaps it means that time is not ours to own. Those moments pass whether we watch them or not. That the presence of life does not depend on the eyes that see it, but on the persistence of what continues in its absence. The clocks are not keeping time for people anymore. They are keeping time for the walls, for the light, for the dust motes that drift slowly through sunbeams, for the silence that has learned to breathe. It's easy to imagine a life once wrapped around this sound, a hand reaching out to wind the clock each Sunday afternoon, a child watching the pendulum swing, mesmerized by its certainty, a kettle boiling just as the mantel clock struck the hour, a visitor saying goodbye as the hallway clock sang out its slow, full tone. These memories are not loud, they do not press into the silence, but the clocks carry them, not as burdens, but as echoes. Now, in the quiet, the ticking is no longer about what comes next. It is about what is, what remains. The clocks are not hurrying anyone along. They are not reminders. They are companions. Gentle, repetitive companions that stay with the moment, no matter how long it lasts. And so the house becomes a kind of vessel, not for sound, but for rhythm. A rhythm that doesn't need to be heard to be real. The clocks tick in rooms where no one stands. They echo through spaces where voices once rose and fell. They keep time not to control it, but to honor it. They do not measure progress. They offer presence. The clocks tick, one after another, second after second. Not aligned, not synchronized. Just scattered voices in a choir of stillness. A collection of soft, steady heartbeats that no one listens for anymore, but that sing all the same. They have become part of the house's structure, as essential as beams, as unnoticed as gravity. And somewhere in that rhythm, there is comfort. Not in knowing what time it is, but in knowing that time still moves, even when we don't. That some things continue even when left alone. That stillness is not emptiness. It is a different kind of fullness. One held together by slow movement, by quiet persistence, by the gentle voice of things that do not ask to be noticed. The clocks tick, and though no one listens, the sound remains. And that somehow is enough. The map room had not been used in years, and yet it had never stopped listening. Its stillness was not emptiness, but a hush, charged with quiet understanding. The dust along the table edges had settled like snow in an old memory, undisturbed but not abandoned. The room had not forgotten its purpose. It had simply adapted to the quiet, folding time into itself, until what it remembered no longer needed voices to stay alive. The maps were still there, rolled and resting, like dormant creatures dreaming under parchment skin. And if one were to listen closely enough, they might have heard the whisper of a truth the room had kept to itself all this time. The map room knew, not in the way a person knows, with logic or deliberate thought, but in the way stone knows cold and paper knows touch. The room had absorbed every gesture, every presence, every silence that had ever passed through it. The footsteps of those who once entered it were not lost. They were merely layered into the wood grain of the floor, pressed down with purpose, left behind without the need for explanation. Each one left a trace, and the room faithful and still, remembered each of them. There had once been a rhythm to the way people moved through the room. Some would hurry in, speaking in half-thoughts, glancing at one map while their fingers traced the edge of another. Others came quietly, as if seeking shelter in the folds of geography, opening maps not to find where they were going, but to be reminded that they could go somewhere at all. The room had watched it all. It had witnessed arguments, whispered decisions, and long silences between two people standing over the same coastlines. It remembered the way hands paused just above mountains, as though wondering whether they could be crossed. It remembered laughter, a kind of surprised exhale that didn't always make sense in context, and the rustle of a map being turned over for the first time in years. And then, slowly, no one came anymore. But that did not mean the knowing stopped. When a room is used often enough, lived in deeply enough, it doesn't need fresh footsteps to keep its memory alive. The residue of presence lingers, the air changes, thickens in places where lives once moved. The map room had learned to listen to the quiet. It paid attention to the drafts that slipped under the door in winter, to the faint creak of beams settling with age, and to the way the rolled maps shifted ever so slightly in their shelves when the house breathed. It listened, and it waited. Not for someone to return, but because knowing how to wait was part of what it had become. Some rooms are made for transition, entryways, hallways, passage zones between one place and another. But the map room had always been a place of pause, of orientation. It was not where journeys began, but where they were imagined. It was where intentions were drawn before they were acted upon, and where possibilities were measured not in miles but in margins. That gave it a kind of still gravity, a silent pull toward consideration. The room had learned to carry that weight well, even after the doors stopped opening, even after the lamps were no longer lit, even after the floor stopped feeling the shuffle of boots or the scratch of chair legs. Still, the map room knew. It knew that people had once stood in front of the great central map, the one mounted on the far wall, yellowed now at the edges, debating whether the border was where it claimed to be. It remembered the ink smudges left by someone too tired to hold the pen steady. It remembered the girl who once traced the rivers with her fingertip, not to follow them, but simply to feel what flow meant. And it remembered the man who left one map open deliberately, as if to say, "This one matters, even if I'm not here to say why." That map was never rolled back up. Over time, its edges curled with humidity and neglect. The corners faded where sunlight touched them at just the right angle each morning. But no one disturbed it. And that stillness itself became a kind of marking. The map had not been forgotten. It had been left where it was for a reason, even if no one remembered the reason anymore. The map room understood. People forget. They move on. They die. Their thoughts get lost between pages that no one reopens. Their intentions become ghosts. But rooms, especially ones that have been asked to hold purpose, do not forget so easily. They absorb. They keep. They become silent archives of unfinished decisions. Perhaps that's what made this room feel different than the others. It had no pretension of grandeur, just a table, some shelves, a few wooden stools, and walls lined with slowly aging records of where people had hoped to go. And that was enough. The maps themselves had become more than documents. They were traces of minds at work, of hands placing possibility onto paper, and the room had kept them all, folded, pinned, marked, left behind. A visitor now, if one were ever to return, might miss the knowing altogether. They might see only a dusty old space with paper and wood and musty air. They might notice the way the light no longer reached the back corner, or how the table bore small nicks and stains from years of use. But they would not hear what the room remembered, unless they listened in the right way. To truly hear what the map room knew, one had to stand still and wait. Wait until the hush became louder than the echoes. Wait until the silence made sense. Wait until the presence of absence became a form of presence all its own. Only then might the visitor notice how the maps seemed to shift ever so slightly in their shelves, as though they sighed with memory. Only then might they notice the soft indent on the stool closest to the open map, the one left behind, showing it had once been a favorite spot. Only then might they feel the warmth still held by the table's surface, like a hand that remembered the heat of another. Only then might they understand that though no voices remained, something here still spoke. Because the map room did not rely on being seen to exist. Its purpose was not tied to attention. It was content being overlooked, if that meant it could remain intact. It did not need explanation or restoration. It simply needed to be. And in its being, it bore quiet witness to the fact that even abandoned things are never empty. There are rooms, after all, that carry stories like lungs carry breath, quietly, in rhythm, without needing to be noticed. This room knew paths that were never taken. It remembered routes rerouted at the last moment. It remembered that one northern coastline someone had marked and then erased, as if unsure whether it was better to remember or to forget. It remembered crossings never completed, margins never filled in, legends never written. It remembered possibility, even when possibility faded. It knew that someone had once stood by the window, map in hand, eyes on the horizon beyond the glass, as if the lines on the page could somehow align with the sky outside. That moment had been brief, but real. The kind of moment that might be lost in memory, but not in place. The room remembered. The person did not. But that was enough. Perhaps the map room understood something more than people ever did. That not all knowledge is meant to be used. Some of it is meant to be held. Gently, quietly, like a name you whisper to yourself, even though no one else speaks it anymore. So the room kept the maps. It kept the empty chair. It kept the curled parchment. It kept the faint traces of fingerprints on the edges of places long ago. And most of all, it kept the open one. The map no one rolled back up. The map that didn't ask for closure, but simply stayed open, waiting not to be read, but to be recognized. Because the map room knew, even if no one else did. And in that knowing, it remained whole, even in stillness, even in quiet, even in time's long, slow forgetting. It was not lonely. It was simply waiting, the way rooms sometimes do, with patience that belongs only to places and not to people. The air will smell of old paper. Not just paper that has aged, but paper that has waited, the kind that sat quietly inside boxes, too fragile to lift, too full of former things to forget. It's not the sharp scent of something recently burned, nor the dry crinkle of something recently written. It's subtler than that. The smell is soft, layered like whispers. It belongs to pages that were turned once, maybe twice, and then not again. Not because they were unimportant, but because their time had simply passed. There's no urgency in this scent, no need for anyone to rush toward it or pull it close. It drifts, it lingers, it rests on the breath like the memory of a room one forgot to close behind them. The scent of old paper doesn't shout of history, it rests in it. It is the quiet hum of time behaving exactly as it always has, unhurried, impartial, and profoundly still. It carries with it no particular moment, and yet all of them. The ink may have faded, and the edges may have worn, but something of the past remains suspended in the fibers of the page, soaked in by years, not by hands. It is a perfume of persistence. It clings not for attention, but for continuity, as if saying, I was here. I still am. You may not need me, but I have not left. Rooms that smell of old paper do not need to be large. Often they are the smallest in the house. A back study, a forgotten attic, a narrow hallway cupboard with a warped door. They have windows, yes, but the light that filters in through them comes gently and always at an angle. It lands on shelves without intention and warms nothing quickly. The paper doesn't complain. It simply continues being what it is, absorbing the temperature of its surroundings, breathing in and out slowly through the seasons, cracking slightly when touched, but never fully crumbling. No one remembers exactly when the papers were placed there. Not really. They arrived slowly, letters no one could throw away, receipts that felt too official to destroy, and a journal that someone meant to finish but didn't. They belong to someone, of course, but the longer they sit, the less they belong to a person, and the more to the place. The air around them adjusts. It adopts their presence. The molecules remember. If you were to open the drawer, the scent would deepen. It would rise softly, not aggressively, not immediately, but gradually, as though waking from a very long sleep. First, the wood itself would creak a little in protest, not unused to movement, but never entirely comfortable with it. Then the air would shift. What was faint becomes firm. The smell becomes almost physical, like dust you could touch if you reached just the right way. It's not only the smell that fills the space, it's a texture of quiet, an acoustic hush that only paper can hold. Even the sound of a single page being moved seems deliberate, slowed by the weight of what it carries. You do not flip through such pages. You turn them. You pause between each one, not to read, though you might, but because each sheet feels like it holds breath, like it waited to be noticed. And noticing takes time. Not all the papers are significant. In fact, most are not. Lists of groceries from decades ago, scribbled phone numbers with no area code, the corner of a crossword puzzle, unfinished, a bill for a service that no longer exists. But they sit there anyway, as if the act of being kept made them worthy. No one questions why they remain. They're folded into the fabric of the room, like paint on a wall or the way a particular window always fogs first in winter. Even the ink has grown tired. What was once crisp and clean is now softened into the grain. Blues have paled to a weary gray. Blacks have taken on the tint of rust. The paper, too, is not the white of new notebooks, but the beige of softened light, of twilight. It holds fingerprints it doesn't show. It has absorbed the oils of hands long gone and the breath of readers who never spoke aloud. Some papers are stacked, some loose. Some are wedged between the pages of books, forgotten as bookmarks and never reclaimed. Some were torn accidentally but were never repaired. Others bear the neat fold of something once important, now undecided. A certificate for something no one recalls. A wedding invitation from a couple long divorced. A funeral card without a date. Each one is quiet now. Each one settled into the stillness of its own timeline. And then there are the margins. The places where thought spilled outside the lines. Where someone wrote a name with too much pressure or underlined a phrase they couldn't let go of. These are the most human parts of the paper, the parts that resist silence. They do not speak loudly, but they hum. Their hum is low and warm and private. They hold emotion the page was never meant to carry, but now cannot release. The smell of old paper also brings with it a kind of still expectancy, as if something might be found if you looked closely enough. Not treasure, not secrets, but something else, evidence of presence. A proof not that someone did something remarkable, but that they existed in the quiet way most of us do. They jotted things down. They filed things away. They left records not for glory, but for the simple reason that it felt wrong to throw them out. Sometimes there are names, written in cursive, often with loops that suggest care. Sometimes printed in block letters, perhaps by someone unsure of their own handwriting. There are dates, but they don't always lead anywhere. A birthday is noted, but no year. A deadline circled, but no task beside it. These fragments are less like a story and more like atmosphere. You don't read them, you breathe them in. And even if you do not open a single box, even if you leave the drawer untouched, the scent still finds you. It's carried in the folds of old curtains. It hovers behind the spines of books. It seeps from between the floorboards, where a receipt might have slipped decades ago and never returned. It drapes over furniture like dust, but settles more slowly. You don't clean it away. You accommodate it. The scent does not fade with time. It deepens, grows into its surroundings until even new paper, brought in by accident or necessity, begins to take it on. It's not a decay. It's a migration, a gradual blending of past and present, of memory into matter. The paper holds on, not because it is stubborn, but because the air is willing. And what does that mean for the room? For the person who might one day enter it? It means that they will not be alone. They will be accompanied, not by ghosts, not by history in any grand or obvious way, but by paper, by the presence of what once mattered enough to be written down. They will breathe in the decisions that once mattered to someone. They will inhale the quiet persistence of pages that did not ask to be saved but were. They will exhale into a space already full. There's something sacred in that kind of air, not holy in the religious sense, holy in the way certain silences are held, not broken. The smell of old paper is a silence you walk through, a calm that collects over time. It does not instruct or interrupt. It does not argue or explain. It simply is. And when you leave the room, the scent will follow. Not on your skin, perhaps, but in the folds of your awareness. You'll think of a paper you once kept long ago in a drawer of your own. You'll remember the feel of the page more than what it said. You might even imagine it waiting still somewhere, becoming part of the air around it. Because that is what paper does in the end. It waits, it settles, and in settling, it changes the very air it waits within. Slowly, patiently, permanently. The room will not react, but it will notice. It will not shift beneath your feet when you step inside. The walls will not shiver in welcome or protest. The ceiling will not draw its breath at your arrival. And yet, your presence does not go unfelt. Something in the stillness will change, almost imperceptibly. A weight will redistribute. The air will rearrange itself around you, soft and soundless. Dust may stir without rising. Shadows may pause without moving. The room will remain what it has always been, quiet, unmoved, composed. But it will know you are there. It will notice. Rooms, after all, are not inert, not entirely, especially those that have been left alone for some time. They become like deep water, placid but alert. A space that has held itself still for days or years becomes sensitive to interruption. It doesn't flinch. It doesn't speak. But it registers the difference between emptiness and company. You open the door and step in. Nothing dramatic happens. The doorknob clicks gently. The hinges offer a tired sigh. Your footsteps are soft, maybe muffled by carpet, maybe echoed faintly on hardwood. You pause just inside the threshold, as people often do when entering a room they're not sure they're welcome in. And still, no response. But the air remembers you. Even if it's your first time in this space, it remembers someone like you. Someone once stood where you are now, even if years ago, even if long forgotten. Rooms do not mistake the outlines of people. They hold them, quietly. They fold them into themselves, the way sand records the shape of a footprint until wind or tide carries it away. You move through the room, slowly, gently. You do not want to disturb it, even if you cannot say why. Perhaps the stillness feels sacred. Perhaps it is just unfamiliar. Perhaps it reminds you of something you can't name. You brush your hand across a shelf and it leaves a faint trail in the dust. The room does not speak, but it notices. That mark will remain, however briefly, as proof that you were here, that you touched something, that you allowed the silence to bend around you. Some rooms are filled with things, books, fabric, and framed photographs. Others are nearly bare, just walls and corners and light. It does not matter. What fills the room is not always what gives it shape. What matters is how the room listens, not with ears, but with stillness, not with judgment, but with endurance. The room will not react when you exhale, when you shift your weight, when your fingers run over the back of a chair without meaning to sit. It will not scold you when you pause too long or walk too quickly. It will not greet you, but it will notice, and you will feel that noticing, not as pressure, but as presence. The sensation that something is aware of you without watching, that something is holding space without asking why you've come. It is a rare kind of welcome, this silent observation. It does not demand, it only makes room. You may find yourself softening in response, speaking more quietly or not at all. You may sit, even if you didn't intend to, or stand a while longer than necessary, allowing the room's stillness to settle into your chest. You might look at things differently, objects that in any other setting would go unseen. A slightly crooked picture frame, the way light pools at the base of the wall, the mark left by furniture long since removed. The room will not react to your gaze, but it will allow it. It will permit you to look, to wonder, and to remember. And if you listen closely, not with ears, but with patience, you may hear something, not a sound, but a sense, a recognition, a faint acknowledgement that you are not the first to stand here, not the only one to breathe this air. Others have passed through, others have paused, and the room has noticed each one. It remembers without record, it keeps without clutter, it notices without clinging. If you speak aloud, the room will not reply, but your voice will sound different here, softer, rounded at the edges. It will bounce off the walls more slowly, or not at all. You may find that you want to say less. Those words feel heavy in this space, or that silence suits you better. You are not being silenced. You are being held. There's a difference. The room will not react if you cry. If you sit with your head bowed and let the silence stretch long and long, if your thoughts wander or your memories rise uninvited, it will not judge the shape of your grief or your joy or your weariness. It will not urge you to leave nor encourage you to stay, but it will hold you gently, the way a room does, the way only stillness can. You may think the room is empty, but it isn't. It is full of breath that came before, of stories that had no audience, of pauses that never resumed. 1,000 unfinished sentences once drifted here. 1,000 footsteps once came and went. The room does not store these moments like objects. It wears them like light, layered, fleeting, soft, a warmth that is always slightly behind the present moment. You may wonder what the room has seen, what arguments it listened to in silence, what laughter it absorbed without echo, what news it received, and what hands closed the door afterward. But the room will not tell you. It is not a narrator. It is a presence. And presences do not explain, but they do notice. They notice when you return, even if it's been years, even if the furniture has changed, or the windows have been painted over, or the floors replaced. The room, beneath all its shifting details, is still the same. It remembers the outline of your footsteps, the weight of your breath, the rhythm of your being. It will not react, but it will notice. And when you leave, it will not grieve. It will not cling to the last trace of your cologne or your coat S movement through the air. It will not press itself against the memory of you, but it will keep the shape of your presence, folded somewhere deep inside its stillness. It will remember that you came, that you sat, that you let yourself be quiet. It will not react when the door closes, but it will notice the way the latch sounds, the way the hinges rest, the way the light changes shape now that you are no longer standing in it. And that noticing, that quiet acknowledgement, will stay, silent, unspoken, undisturbed, until the next person enters. And the room, unchanged, will listen again, not to what is said, but to what is felt. And once more it will not react, but it will notice. And that will be enough. The maps had been drawn long ago by hands steady with intention. Ink had dried on thick, weathered parchment that creaked slightly when unrolled, and each stroke seemed to promise certainty. The lines were fine, unwavering, stretching like threads sewn into meaning. Coasts were marked with gentle curves, rivers etched like veins branching toward the sea, and mountains stood proud and triangular, each peak crowned with a symbolic crosshatch. Towns were dots, cities, circles, roads, a tangle of lines that knew where they were going even when those who followed them no longer did. The compass rose in the corner, pointed confidently north, as if to remind the viewer. Direction was not a question, but a fact. The thing about maps is that they do not age at the same pace as the world. Fields grow wild, borders change hands, rivers shift courses slightly over generations, and whole settlements vanish, swallowed by trees or sand or quiet. But the maps stay still. They do not flinch when the future arrives, do not redraw themselves to keep up with erosion or politics. They hold their version of the world with a kind of quiet pride, like someone telling a story exactly the way they heard it, even if they're not sure anymore who told it first. And so, despite time moving on in its meandering, often indifferent way, the maps are still accurate. Somehow, they're accurate, not in the sense of GPS precision, nor exact distances measured by modern instruments, but in another way, a way that matters more when one is lost not only in landscape, but in life. They are accurate in intention. They are accurate in memory. They are accurate in their belief that somewhere out there is a place meant to be found. If you sat at the old table, the one with grooves in the wood from generations of elbows, and spread one of these maps across its surface, the table would welcome it like an old friend. The corners would not fight the flatness. The folds would settle into the grain as though they belonged there. Perhaps the lamp beside you would flicker a little, casting golden light across the paper's soft creases. And for a moment, the air would still, as if waiting for your next breath to decide something. What these maps offered wasn't just geography, but trust. They trusted that the mountains had not entirely vanished, even if their names had. Those roads, though renamed and repaved, still traveled in roughly the same direction. That if you were to follow the inked line from one village to another, even if those villages no longer stood, you would encounter something. Some memory, some echo, some familiar tilt of the land beneath your feet that would make you pause and say, yes, this is right. Accuracy, then, was not about perfection. It was about alignment. It was about the quiet thrill of recognizing a bend in the river, or even if the trees along its bank were different now. It was about standing at the base of a hill and knowing without needing to be told that it had once been called Wind's Crown, because the way the air moved at its peak made your hair lift gently like it had something to say. It was about finding your way not through names and measurements, but through a feeling of arrival, when your bones settled and your breath eased, and the world stopped spinning for just long enough to let you belong. Perhaps the map had been passed down, folded neatly in a drawer, then forgotten behind a stack of other folded things, old letters, fabric scraps, a dried flower still pressed between two recipes. Perhaps someone found it again one rainy afternoon while searching for something else. They might not have recognized the names written in the margins or the places marked with stars and circles, but they'd know, somehow, that it was meant to be looked at, meant to be held. There is comfort in such maps. Comfort in tracing the paths with your finger, even if your feet never follow. Comfort in the knowledge that someone once believed in the layout of this world, enough to write it down and send it forward in time. And even if the world changed around it, the map still whispered, "Start here." It didn't need to say more. Sometimes, the most accurate maps are the ones that were never quite finished. The ones with blank spaces labeled unknown, or margins scribbled with small hesitant notes, possibly ruins here, or ask the man by the red barn. These uncertain details do not weaken the map, they make it more honest. They remind you that discovery is not a straight line, and that the act of searching is part of the route itself. And when you travel with such a map, one out of date by decades or centuries, you begin to notice how accuracy reveals itself differently. A tree you find growing beside a path might not have existed when the path was first walked, but now it leans just so, offering shade to the traveler who pauses beneath it. A bridge may be gone, but the stones on either bank still slope toward one another, as if the memory of crossing remains. Even the silence between landmarks carries a kind of guidance. You learn to read more than just the ink. You learn to read the hush, the hesitation, the wonder. Accuracy somehow lives in that hush. There's a kind of beauty in how the map doesn't mind if you stray. It doesn't beep at you. It doesn't shout, recalculating. It simply waits, steady in its ink and its lines, trusting that you will find your way in time. If not now, then later. If not by the road, then by the stars. If not with certainty, then with curiosity. And maybe the most accurate part of all is this. The map was made by someone who cared enough to make it. That care is evident in the details. The curve of the coastline was drawn with such a delicate hand, the names chosen with reverence or humor or both. The way some features are more embellished than others, not because they were more important in reality, but because they mattered more to the person holding the pen. A well with the note, "Good water." A barn marked, "Safe in storms." A tree simply labeled, "Old friend." What could be more accurate than that? Accuracy, in the end, might not be about getting every landmark right. It might be about reminding us that people have always tried to understand where they are and how to move forward. It might be about letting us glimpse the mindset of a long-gone cartographer who once stood still in a shifting world and said, "Let me help." And when you hold the map now, feeling the paper soften with age and time, you are not just navigating geography. You are navigating memory. You are walking with those who came before. You are letting them guide you, not with perfect directions, but with the kind of quiet wisdom that trusts your steps will eventually match their hopes. So, yes, the maps will still be accurate. Not because the cities are all still standing or the roads still unbroken, but because their purpose remains intact. Because they were made to hold meaning, and meaning once drawn tends to linger. Even if the stars have shifted, even if the names have changed, even if the traveler is you, centuries later, seeking something you can't quite name, the map will still point, still wait, still believe. And that somehow is enough. The door will still open the same way. There is something quietly dependable about that fact. It doesn't draw attention, doesn't ask to be noticed, and yet, in its quiet persistence, there is a kind of comfort. The mechanism unchanged. The hinges are still catching slightly at the midpoint. The handle is still cool to the touch in the mornings and warm in the late afternoon. And the weight, the slight resistance followed by the gentle give, as if the door recognizes your hand even now. It is easy to forget the things that do not change. They are always there, performing their silent duties while attention is spent elsewhere, on noise, on urgency, on change. But the door has not been moved. It has not decided to alter its swing, nor asked for gratitude. It simply continues. It opens the same way it always has, and perhaps always will, long after the need to open it has faded into memory. Perhaps that's the thing. The door doesn't know who opens it, or why. It only knows how. And in a world where so many things ask for purpose and demand justification, the door simply offers function, an answer without a question. It will not change with mood, or fashion, or era. It will creak in the same place, It will pause slightly before closing. It will whisper in its wooden frame and then be still. Once someone passed through this door every day, several times a day. Once there were footsteps that echoed faintly through the space behind it. Shoes tapping, slippers dragging, the occasional quick dash that betrayed a moment of forgetfulness or surprise. There was the sound of keys, sometimes laughter, and a voice calling out something small like "back soon" or "just a minute." It all passed through this door, folding itself into the air like breath into cloth. But now, there are no voices, no footsteps, only the occasional groan of wood adjusting to the temperature. The air here is still, not because it lacks life, but because the life that once filled it has paused, or left, or waited too long and quietly dissipated into stillness. Yet the door remains. It will still open the same way. Even the dust respects it, collecting along the top edge but not disturbing its motion. No cobweb stretches across its arc. No rust on the handle. It is not unused, only patient. It waits, if such a thing can be said of doors. Or rather, it doesn't wait. It just is. Ready, should the moment arise. Content, if it does not. There is something deeply human about this small, unnoticed continuity. In our lives, we change. Our faces, our thoughts, and our memories soften or sharpen depending on the years. But the hand might still remember how the door moves. The arm, without thought, might still know its weight. The body might remember the angle, the rhythm, and the resistance. It is one of those physical knowings that outlasts reason. And maybe one day, someone will come back. Someone will stand in front of it, pause, and reach out. Their fingers will hesitate just slightly. Whether from uncertainty or memory or reverence, it won't matter. And then they will push, gently, not expecting much. And it will yield. It will open just the same way. There will be a sound, familiar but faint. The creak will be a small acknowledgement, not a protest. A nod rather than a cry. The door will say nothing, but the air behind it might. What's strange is how few people think about the door. They think of the room, or what's beyond it. They remember the furniture, the smell, and the colors. But the door is simply what one passes through. It is not a destination. It is not a spectacle. It is a transition, quiet and necessary and almost invisible. Until one day it isn't. Until one day you stand in front of it and wonder, who last closed this? Did they mean to come back? Did they pause before they walked away? Or did they too think it would always be there, unchanged and unchanging? It's difficult to explain why such a simple thing should carry such weight. But it does. Because even when everything else is unfamiliar, even when the chairs have been covered and the windows fogged and the hallway quieted, the door is the same. And that sameness doesn't demand celebration. It offers grounding. There is power in the unchanging. It lets us anchor ourselves to something when the tide of memory or grief or nostalgia pulls hard. It says, "You've been here before." It says, "The world turns, but this still knows you." It says, "Your hand has done this, your breath has passed this threshold, and your shadow has lengthened across this space." It says, "This is a place that remembers, even if it doesn't speak." The door is not waiting. It is not lonely. It does not long for anything. But it is available. It is ready. And perhaps that is all any of us can ask from the things we leave behind. That they not forget how to meet us, should we return. That they not shift so dramatically that we can no longer find the outline of what once was. There are many doors in a lifetime. Some are metaphorical, choices, turning points, and endings. Others are literal and physical and specific. This door is not a symbol. It is a real piece of wood and hinge and handle. But like all real things, it becomes more than itself through use, through presence, through memory. It collects significance not by declaring it, but by receiving it. If you were to sit beside it, quietly, you might begin to notice the details you once overlooked. the way the paint is chipped near the bottom, where someone's boot once knocked against it, the faint scrape on the edge where keys had missed the lock too often in the dark, the worn edge on the frame where the door has leaned ever so slightly from repetition. These are not flaws. They are evidence, proof that it has served, and still it will open the same way. Perhaps someone once thought to replace it. Maybe they said, "This door sticks," or "It lets in too much air," or "It doesn't match the rest." But they didn't. For whatever reason, it remained. And because it remained, it continued. And because it continued, it became more than its function. One day the house will be empty of all memory. One day the air will not carry the smell of bread or books or afternoon sun. One day even the wind will pass through without pause. But the door will still swing open in that same gentle arc. And in that movement, there is the echo of every time it did before. Every entrance, every exit, every quiet opening at dawn or cautious return at dusk. Every time someone left in a hurry, every time someone paused before going, it is all there, held not in the material but in the motion. We often look for signs that something remains, that something remembers us. We think of photographs, letters, journals, and names etched in soft stone. But sometimes the memory is not in words. It is not in the image or inscription. Sometimes it is in the motion of a door that still knows how to yield. That still opens the same way it always did, even when no one is looking. There is no urgency in this, no climax, no revelation, only continuation, the kind that does not ask to be admired, the kind that persists without fanfare. And in that quiet, there is peace. If you walk away again, the door will not protest. If you return, it will not celebrate. It will simply do what it has always done. You will touch it, and it will move. And perhaps, for just a moment, you will feel what it means to be met without condition, to be remembered not by name, but by rhythm, to be welcomed not with words, but with familiarity. The door will still open the same way. That is all, and somehow that is everything. That is, the door will still open the same way. There is something quietly dependable about that fact. It doesn't draw attention, doesn't ask to be noticed, and yet, in its quiet persistence, there is a kind of comfort. The mechanism unchanged. The hinges still catching slightly at the midpoint. The handle still cool to the touch in the mornings and warm in the late afternoon. And the weight, the slight resistance followed by the gentle give, as if the door recognizes your hand even now. It is easy to forget the things that do not change. They are always there, performing their silent duties while attention is spent elsewhere, on noise, on urgency, on change. But the door has not been moved. It has not decided to alter its swing, nor asked for gratitude. It simply continues. It opens the same way it always has, and perhaps always will, long after the need to open it has faded into memory. Perhaps that's the thing. The door doesn't know who opens it, or why. It only knows how. And in a world where so many things ask for purpose, demand justification, the door simply offers function, an answer without a question. It will not change with mood or fashion or era. It will creak in the same place. It will pause slightly before closing. It will whisper in its wooden frame and then still. Once someone passed through this door every day, several times a day. Once there were footsteps that echoed faintly through the space behind it. Shoes tapping, slippers dragging, the occasional quick dash that betrayed a moment of forgetfulness or surprise. There was the sound of keys, sometimes laughter, a voice calling out something small like "back soon" or "just a minute." It all passed through this door, folding itself into the air like breath into cloth. But now there are no voices, no footsteps, only the occasional groan of wood adjusting to the temperature. The air here is still, not because it lacks life, but because the life that once filled it has paused, or left, or waited too long and quietly dissipated into stillness. Yet the door remains. It will still open the same way. Even the dust respects it, collecting along the top edge but not disturbing its motion. No cobweb stretches across its arc. No rust on the handle. It is not unused, only patient. It waits, if such a thing can be said of doors. Or rather, it doesn't wait. It just is. Ready, should the moment arise. Content, if it does not. There is something deeply human about this small, unnoticed continuity. In our lives, we change. Our faces, our thoughts, our memories soften or sharpen depending on the years. But the hand might still remember how the door moves. The arm, without thought, might still know its weight. The body might remember the angle, the rhythm, the resistance. It is one of those physical knowings that outlasts reason. And maybe one day, someone will come back. Someone will stand in front of it, pause, and reach out. Their fingers will hesitate just slightly. Whether from uncertainty or memory or reverence, it won't matter. And then they will push, gently, not expecting much. And it will yield. It will open just the same way. There will be a sound, familiar but faint. The creak will be a small acknowledgement, not a protest. A nod rather than a cry. The door will say nothing, but the air behind it might. What's strange is how few people think about the door. They think of the room or what's beyond it. They remember the furniture, the smell, the colors. But the door? The door is simply what one passes through. It is not a destination. It is not a spectacle. It is a transition, quiet and necessary and almost invisible. Until one day it isn't. Until one day you stand in front of it and wonder, who last closed this? Did they mean to come back? Did they pause before they walked away? Or did they too think it would always be there, unchanged and unchanging? It's difficult to explain why such a simple thing should carry such weight. But it does. Because even when everything else is unfamiliar, even when the chairs have been covered and the windows fogged and the hallway quieted, the door is the same. And that sameness doesn't demand celebration. It offers grounding. There is power in the unchanging. It lets us anchor ourselves to something when the tide of memory or grief or nostalgia pulls hard. It says, you've been here before. It says, the world turns, but this still knows you. It says, your hand has done this. Your breath has passed this threshold. Your shadow has lengthened across this space. It says, this is a place that remembers, even if it doesn't speak. The door is not waiting. It is not lonely. It does not take long for anything. But it is available. It is ready. And perhaps that is all any of us can ask from the things we leave behind. That they not forget how to meet us, should we return. That they not shift so dramatically that we can no longer find the outline of what once was. There are many doors in a lifetime. Some are metaphorical. Choices, turning points, endings. Others are literal and physical and specific. This door is not a symbol. It is a real piece of wood and a hing a anadi handle. But like all real things, it becomes more than itself through use, through presence, through memory. It collects significance not by declaring it, but by receiving it. If you were to sit beside it quietly, you might begin to notice the details you once overlooked. The way the paint is chipped near the bottom, where someone's boot once knocked against it. The faint scrape on the edge, where keys had missed the lock too often in the dark. The worn edge on the frame, where the door has leaned ever so slightly, is from repetition. These are not flaws. They are evidence, proof that it has served. And still it will open the same way. Perhaps someone once thought to replace it. Maybe they said, this door sticks, or it lets in too much air, or it doesn't match the rest. But they didn't. For whatever reason, it remained. And because it remained, it continued. And because it continued, it became more than its function. One day, the house will be empty of all memory. One day, the air will not carry the smell of bread or books or afternoon sun. One day, even the wind will pass through without pause. But the door will still swing open in that same gentle arc, and in that movement, there is the echo of every time it did before. Every entrance, every exit, every quiet opening at dawn or cautious return at dusk. Every time someone left in a hurry, every time someone paused before going. It is all there, held not in the material, but in the motion. We often look for signs that something remains, that something remembers us. We think of photographs, letters, journal and names etched in soft stone. But sometimes the memory is not in words. It is not in the image or inscription. Sometimes it is in the motion of a door that still knows how to yield, that still opens the same way it always did, even when no one is looking. There is no urgency in this, no climax, no revelation, only continuation, the kind that does not ask to be admired, the kind that persists without fanfare. And in that quiet, there is peace. If you walk away again, the door will not protest. If you return, it will not celebrate. It will simply do what it has always done. You will touch it, and it will move. And perhaps, for just a moment, you will feel what it means to be met without condition. To be remembered not by name, but by rhythm. To be welcomed not with words, but with familiarity. The door will still open the same way, that is all, and somehow that is everything.